Lucifer may be based on a comic book, but the characters look very different from their comic inspiration.
Why?
Lucifer has been a smash hit since it first released on Fox before heading over to Netflix, with it being heralded for its comedy, storylines, and biblical references. But the character of Lucifer started in comic book form initially in Neil Gaiman's Sandman comics before spawning his own series. But they all look a little different than they do on the show. In this video, we'll take a look at some of the biggest changes and how the characters' looks have altered from the page onto the screen, including some characters who didn't even appear at all in the comics.
He's the best Lucifer we've had in years.
While the premise of the show is relatively similar to the core premise of the comics, with the devil leaving hell to live a life of debauchery on Earth, the show quickly veered off from the comics, with the show following a typical crime procedural format as well as being much lighter in tone. They also took many liberties with the character of Lucifer and certainly his look. Tom Ellis is certainly a great leading man who oozes charisma with his dark hair and devilish good looks, but he looks almost nothing like the comic book character.
Would you tell people what is wrong with you?
In fact, the character from the comics has bright blonde hair and green eyes and looks much more reminiscent of an archangel, which is central to Lucifer's roots. They even make a joke about it in the show when a cultist asks Lucifer,
You're supposed to be blonde.
The answer to that question is yes, but not only is the character's look centered on the archangel look, but when Neil Gaiman brought the character into Sandman, he actually modeled the character on one of the biggest music idols and cultural icons of all time, David Bowie. In early interpretations, you can certainly see the resemblance, but Tom Ellis, on the other hand, doesn't share a resemblance. In fact, Ellis's inspiration for the character was poet Oscar Wilde, which, I mean, he looks more alike, but still not really. Also, the show also had planned to make the character American, but after hearing Ellis's American accent, decided that his natural British one sounded better for the character. So, I mean, I guess he has that in common with Bowie. Amenadiel is probably one of the most changed characters from comic book to TV series. While some of Lucifer's motivations and actions differ, his relationship with Amenadiel is probably the most different. It does start basically the same, however. Lucifer and Amenadiel are both brothers and have a sibling rivalry, and Amenadiel is driven by his loyalty to God and his dislike of Lucifer. But their storylines veer off from there. In the comics, he's essentially a big dumb brute who's aggressive and vengeful, constantly seeking to beat his brother, but always being outwitted. In fact, his death comes at the hands of his brother, who beats him in combat as the two of them duel in hell before Lucifer outsmarts and beats him and proceeds to eat his heart. Jeez, what a way to go. The show actually makes a joke about this in the pilot, with Lucifer making an offhand remark that he is looking forward to eating his heart. But in the TV show, his arc is completely different, and he actually has a lot more depth, even questioning his father's authority, having a romantic relationship, and even becoming a father as well, of course allying himself with his mischievous brother. But you will also notice a big visual difference between the comic book character and the on-screen character. The muscles may be the same, but the Amenadiel is a rather ugly fellow with long white hair, making him fair-haired like his brother and looking like a long-lost Witcher character. So yeah, a little different. Mazikeen is one of Lucifer's only friends/allies, and Lucifer even goes as far as giving her affection in the comic books, because even the devil is capable of love, apparently. One of her most notable features is actually the same in both the comics and the series, and that is that half of her face shows exposed muscle, bone, and even brain. But in the show, we only actually see her real face once in the Halloween episode where Mazikeen finally appears in a comic book accurate moment. But she quickly hides it and plays it off as a Halloween costume, and often shows her face as whole in the show as to be more visually appealing to the humans and not to stand out in a crowd. Another reason is probably it would have cost a fortune in VFX to have her face like that the whole time. Also, it could be a practical reason too. In the comics, Mazikeen wears a Phantom of the Opera-style mask to cover half of her face. But that makes her speech muffled, which makes it rather difficult and annoying to read. We do see the mask in the alternate universe episode, but that is the only time we see the mask in the show, and it is generally omitted. Also, Mazikeen is a much more loyal ally to Lucifer in the show, and she's often planning coups against him in the comic books. Some friend she is. One character who looks very different in the show is Chloe, and that's because, well, she doesn't exist. That's right. While Chloe is a main part of the show and the primary love interest of the show, she isn't a feature in the comics, with Lucifer not actually sharing any real romance with humans. The character of Chloe was created for the show in order to add to the crime procedural format and is used to drive the narrative forward. But that doesn't mean Chloe doesn't share any traits to any character in the comics. It's believed that Chloe is a stand-in for the character of Elaine Belloc. That's mostly because they share similar origins with angels, having a hand in their creation. In the show, Michael receives an implicit order from Yahweh to bless Penelope, so she is able to conceive Chloe. Elaine is an angel-human hybrid who is incubated by the angel Michael before being put into a human for birth. So different from Chloe, but there are similarities. They may be different, but Chloe and Elaine both seemingly seem to have a connection to Lucifer, and their lives are forever intertwined. In Season 3 of the show, we're introduced to Pierce, played by the actor Tom Welling, or as we actually find out, Cain, voted Worst Brother of the Year by Abel. Cain also does appear in the comics, but his appearance is almost completely different. In the show, Cain is a formidable opponent to Lucifer, and a consistent thorn in his side with him holding a commanding and rather intimidating presence. Even more than Lucifer himself, which is probably helped by the fact he is played by Superman. In the comics, however, Cain's run-in with Lucifer goes very differently. The Dream of the Endless sends Cain to hell as an emissary, with Cain protected by the Mark of Yahweh. But Lucifer seemingly didn't think much of Cain. Cain survived the encounter with Lucifer, but the devil carried Cain around by his hair and left him absolutely traumatized. Also, his appearance is a lot more impish than that of Welling, who's much more commanding physically. While Lux is a location rather than a character, it almost serves as a spiritual character, seeing as it is the place Lucifer resides when he moves to Earth. In terms of accuracy, the show actually does a pretty darn good job getting the set to look like how it's depicted in the comics. In fact, it's so similar that it looks like the illustrations from the page really did just come to life. The set designers paid a lot of attention to detail, with the chandelier, placement of the mirrors, and the piano all set almost exactly how they are in the comic book. So you have to give everyone who worked on the set props for this one, pun fully intended. The only slight difference between the Lux and the comics is that Lucifer actually spends very little time there with him, often engaging in some kind of off-world adventure. The Lucifer in the comics is often seen at his piano bar meanwhile, and as changes go, it's a very small one. The Presence, otherwise known as Yahweh in the comics, is the father of Lucifer, just like the show, but his appearance is rather different. In the comics, the Presence is the most powerful character in the DC universe, with him being, of course, omniscient and omnipotent. The Presence has taken several forms, such as the Hand, the Voice, and of course the Presence. But we do see him briefly in human form, but his look is rather different. With a bowler hat, mustache, and suit, he looks like a train conductor or a Victorian-style villain than the most powerful being in the universe. His appearance in the show is quite different, with actor Dennis Haysbert giving the character a more caring, powerful, ethereal, and fatherly portrayal. Lucifer's mother in the comics also looks different, and that's because she doesn't really exist, with the Presence seemingly being Lucifer's sole creator. In the show, though, Lucifer's mother is Goddess, who falls in love with God, with their relationship causing the Big Bang and starting creation of the universe. However, Goddess develops a hatred for humans and begins causing floods and plagues to torment humanity, and is subsequently sent to hell. She eventually escapes and becomes one of the primary antagonists of the show, with her appearing in the form of Charlotte Richards. So, yeah, that one's different than the comics. Another character who was also created for the show and therefore not represented in the comic books is Dan Espinosa, a LA homicide detective and Chloe's ex-husband. Like Chloe, Dan was primarily created for the plot, to drive forward and match the crime procedural elements, and because of this has many interactions with Lucifer as he proceeds to assist with investigations. Although their relationship is somewhat strained, given all the name-calling and Lucifer's relationship with his ex-wife. While a major character in the show, he is just that, and not an element in the comics. Seeing as Trixie is the daughter of two characters primarily made up for the series, Dan and Chloe, it is no surprise then to learn that Trixie is also not a part of the comics. Trixie is a sweet, outgoing child who adds further depth and human connection to the characters, with her even befriending Lucifer and Maze. Sadly, though, she doesn't appear in the comics, so we unfortunately can't say what she would have looked like. What did you make of this list? Are you a fan of the comics or just the show? Are there any characters from the comics you'd like to see in the show? Let us know in the comments below, and make sure to like and subscribe to the channel today for all this and more interesting content.